He stood motionless, his breath caught somewhere between his lungs and the cold air. A flickering torch on the dungeon wall cast shadows that seemed to mock him. Long, twisted shapes dancing like demons, celebrating a feast. The iron door behind him clanged shut with a finality that left no room for mercy. And at his feet, the first faint scratching of claws against stone echoed in that cavern of death. The man had once been a master of secrets, a spy they said sent by kings, who whispered of conquest and betrayal. But here in the bowels of a medieval fortress, all secrets were meaningless. The stone walls did not care for alliances. The rats gathering in the dark corners cared only for flesh. His flesh, and tonight they would dine. It wasn't the sword that would claim him. No arrow would pierce his heart. No gallows would stretch his neck. His sentence had been passed by men who smiled as they spoke of honor, but who delighted in cruelty beyond the battlefield. Let him be devoured, they had decreed as a lesson to those who think the shadows can protect them. A lesson written not in ink, but in blood and gnawed bone. He tried to step back, but his heels met the damp stone wall. Nowhere to run, nowhere to plead. His eyes darted to the single slit of moonlight cutting through the chamber, a mockery of freedom, so close, so unreachable. Below, the scratching grew louder. The rats were no longer waiting. Hunger made them bold. The first one emerged, thin, ragged, with patches of fur, missing its eyes glinting red in the torchlight. It sniffed the air, caught the scent of terror, and crept forward. There was no clash of armies, no blare of trumpets, only the soft, wet sound of teeth sinking into flesh, the beginning of the end. He gasped, then screamed as another rat joined the first, then another. The floor seemed alive, a black wave of vermin surging forward, drawn by the scent of blood and sweat by the promise of meat. And above, the guards watched. From a narrow gallery hidden in shadows, they listened to his cries with the same disinterest one might reserve for the slaughter of a pig. This was not justice. This was spectacle. A reminder that in these lands, betrayal was repaid not with steel, but with slow, agonizing ruin. But how did it come to this? How did a man once trusted to carry the secrets of empires end as a banquet for vermin? What war, what madness had turned kings into butchers and spies into carrion? To answer that, we must leave this dungeon for a moment, leave the stench of blood and the chorus of rats, and look to the world that built this nightmare. Medieval Europe, a continent torn by endless wars where kingdoms rose and fell like tides, and loyalty was as thin as parchment. There were no rules here, not truly. Treaties were signed with one hand while the other gripped a dagger. Alliances shifted like sand in a storm, and in this chaos, spies became both weapon and curse. They were the shadows that whispered of plots, the unseen hand that tipped the scales of battle. But when caught, they became the perfect victims for rulers eager to show their strength. Imagine the scene, a banquet hall heavy with the smell of roasted meat and spilled wine. A king raises his goblet, eyes glittering beneath a golden crown, and speaks of honor, of justice, of the treachery that gnaws at the heart of his realm. The lords nod their faces, masks of outrage. But in their hearts, they savor the drama, the chance to see blood spilled without risking their own. The order is given. The spy, once cloaked in silk and secrets, is dragged from his cell. He begs not for life, but for death by sword, by rope, by any means that would grant him the dignity of a soldier's end. But dignity is not on offer tonight. No, tonight, the message must be clear: betray this crown, and you will not simply die, you will be unmade, devoured, erased. And so he is led down stone steps slick with centuries of filth into the pit where no prayers are heard. The rats await, the door shuts, and the king drinks, the lords laugh, and outside the people whisper of what happens to traitors. But beneath the cruelty lies a deeper truth, one that kings and spies alike understood. In a world without laws, terror was the only currency. When the sword could not reach every enemy, the story of the spy devoured by rats would travel farther than any blade. It would linger in taverns and marketplaces in the minds of every would-be traitor, a horror that no battle could match. And so the rats became soldiers of fear. The dungeon a stage for a grim theater where pain spoke louder than decrees. The spy, once a master of whispers, became a silent warning that in the Game of Thrones, no, not the one of fiction, but the brutal, stinking reality of medieval Europe, betrayal was paid for in flesh. As the last of his screams faded into ragged sobs, as the torchlight flickered and the rats feasted, the world above turned on. The king plotted his next war. The lords toasted their survival. And in the shadows, another spy watched and learned what fate awaited him if ever he too was unmasked. The dungeon fell silent, save for the soft gnawing of teeth on bone. The lesson had been written. Not in scrolls, not in royal edicts, but in the blood that stained the stones and the bones that would be buried beneath them. And so as we leave this chamber and step back into the cold night of medieval Europe, a question lingers heavy and unanswered. How many more would fall not to swords or arrows, but to the hunger of the unseen? How many more would pay the price for playing a game where loyalty was bought and sold, like cattle at market? The story does not end here. To truly understand why the rats feasted tonight, we must look deeper into the wars that tore kingdoms apart, into the kings who ruled by terror, into the spies who gambled with their souls. Only then can we see how a man became a meal and how fear became the true ruler of the age. He was not born to die in the dark. He was not born for the teeth of vermin. In a quiet village far from the roaring castles of kings, a boy once chased the morning sun across green fields. His laughter rang out beneath the boughs of ancient trees. He was a son, a brother, a boy like any other until war came. War, that cruel sculptor of destiny, shaped him early. The year the invaders came, he watched his father fall a spear in his chest. He watched his mother dragged from their burning home, her cries lost beneath the clash of steel and the roar of flames. And the boy ran into the woods, into the shadows, into survival. By 13, his face was hard. His eyes, darker than the forest that had sheltered him, saw the world for what it was, a place where the strong took and the weak served. And so he chose not to serve. Not again. Not ever. They called him many names over the years. Courier, informant, agent, spy. But he thought of himself as a survivor, one who moved between worlds, between kings and rebels, slipping through cracks, living off secrets. He learned to read not books, but men. He learned the weight of a bribe, the measure of a threat, the scent of fear. By 20, he could vanish into a crowd. By 25, he could kill without leaving a mark. And the kings, oh the kings, paid well for his talents. Letters stolen from enemy camps. Plans whispered in his ear beneath the cover of night. Betrayals arranged, assassinations set in motion, all for gold, all for the promise of a safer tomorrow that never came. But gold tarnishes and promises rot. And in a world where trust was as thin as mist, it was only a matter of time before his name, once spoken in admiration, was hissed in hatred. One autumn night, beneath a harvest moon, the end began. A letter sealed with a rival king's crest found in his possession. A charge of treason whispered into the ear of a drunken lord. A bounty placed upon his head, more gold than most men would see in a lifetime. He ran, of course. He always ran. Through forests that had once hidden him as a boy. Across rivers that had carried the blood of battles. But the net had been cast wide, and the hunters this time were not common soldiers. These were the king's shadows men, as ruthless as he men, who knew the tricks. He knew men who had no mercy left in them. The capture was swift, a trap laid in a ruined chapel. He had paused foolishly to drink from a broken font, the water black with age. They fell upon him in silence, ropes and chains, fists and boots. He fought, but the odds were against him. A blow to the temple sent him to darkness. And so from the forests and rivers he was dragged to stone and shadow, to the dungeon, to the rats. But why rats? Why not the clean stroke of an executioner's blade? Why not a noose, a gallows, a public spectacle? Because fear fed kingdoms better than bread. And kings, oh kings, they understood that nothing lingered in the heart like a tale of horror. A beheading was swift, a hanging final. But a man devoured piece by creatures of filth that was a warning that would outlive the king himself. And so as he lay chained in the dark, the rats were starved, kept from food for days, driven mad by hunger. The guards would throw down scraps at first to stir them, to let them taste blood, to prepare them for the feast to come. He knew. Of course he knew. The first night he heard the scurrying beneath the stones. The second he saw the red eyes in the gloom. The third he felt the cold noses brush his skin as he slept, if sleep it could be called. And on the fourth they came in earnest. The first bite was always the worst, the shock more than the pain. The knowledge that there would be no rescue, no mercy, no end but the one carved by tiny relentless teeth. He kicked, he screamed, he prayed. But the stone walls did not answer. The guards above did not hear or chose not to. And the rats, they feasted. Outside the dungeon, the castle thrummed with life. The great hall blazed with firelight. Minstrels sang of valor and victory. The king dined well that night, wine spilling like blood upon the table. And all the while beneath his feet the lesson unfolded. A lesson to his enemies, the crown's justice is patient, pitiless, and poetic. A lesson to his allies' loyalty is life and betrayal, a banquet for the lowest of creatures. But in truth, the king feared the shadows that spies moved through, feared the words that might be whispered against him, feared the very tools he wielded. And so he killed not just the man, but the symbol, made of him a story to frighten children, to silence dissent, to remind all who served that no one was beyond the reach of royal wrath. As dawn broke, the guards came down at last. What they found was not a man, but what was left of him, torn, gnawed, unrecognizable. They shoveled the remains into a pit, as if burying not a body but a secret. No marker, no prayer, no memory. And yet memory is a strange thing. The tale lived on, a spy devoured, a king's fury made flesh, a warning etched in blood and bone. But the tale is not over. The rats had feasted, but the kingdom, oh the kingdom, would soon face hungers of its own. Hungers that no dungeon could contain. The rats had eaten their fill. But above in the halls of power, the hunger was only beginning. The king, that weary god draped in velvet and guarded by steel, believed he had silenced the storm. He believed the spy's screams had sealed the cracks in his crumbling throne. But fear, once unleashed, is a beast that turns on its master. Whispers spread faster than any royal decree. From the kitchens to the chapels, from the market stalls to the courtiers' chambers, the tale of the man devoured by rats wove itself into every heart. And where the king had intended terror, he bred disgust, revulsion, and worse, pity. For even the most loyal began to wonder if this was the fate of spies, what fate awaited those who served, yet stumbled. What price would be paid for the slightest misstep? And so suspicion became the air they breathed. Every word weighed, every glance measured, every silence feared. The court, once a stage for games of wit and charm, became a theater of mass. Smiles that hid dread, laughter that echoed hollow against cold stone. The king noticed. How could he not? The toasts grew fewer, the halls quieter. Eyes turned away when he entered. The songs sung in his honor faltered, the verses unfinished. And still he thought the cure lay in more control, more punishment. He saw plots where there were none. He imagined traitors in the faces of old friends. He summoned his ministers in the dead of night, demanding oaths, confessions, loyalty sworn in blood. And they gave it, oh, how they gave it, with trembling voices and shaking hands. For they knew the price of hesitation. They had heard the tale. They had seen the rats. But the king was not satisfied. Fear gnawed at him as surely as the vermin had gnawed at the spy. And so the circle tightened. Spies to watch the spies. Agents to watch the agents. A web of watchers, each snaring the other. A kingdom strangling itself in its own cords of mistrust. And as this invisible war raged within palace walls beyond them, the realm frayed at the edges. The peasants, the merchants, the soldiers, they too heard the story. And they too understood the lesson. Not that the king was strong, no, that the king was afraid. That his power was built not on love, not on justice, but on the sickly foundation of terror. And so began the slow rebellion of the heart, the turning away, the quiet refusals, the taxes left unpaid. The orders followed a little slower with a little less care. The loyalty that cannot be freely given, only forced, is no loyalty at all. And cracks appeared. Cracks the king could not see or would not see, blinded as he was by his own paranoia. Those closest to him paid first. A trusted lord found dead in his bed, poison in the goblet meant for sleep. A captain of the guard vanished on the road, his men silent, their eyes hard. And still the king raged, certain that only more blood would cleanse the rot, his own rot. He ordered executions, swift, brutal, public. He demanded confessions from men too broken to speak. He filled his dungeons with the bodies of those who had once stood at his side. And the rats, oh the rats, feasted well. Again and again the dungeons echoed with their banquet, until even the jailers turned pale at the sound. But the king, he smiled, a smile that did not reach his eyes. A smile that tried to convince the world and himself that he was master of all he surveyed, that he was not in fact the most hunted man in his own kingdom. And in the dark corners, in the shadows where the rats had first stirred, new whispers rose. Whispers of rebellion, of vengeance, of a kingdom where no man, king or commoner, would ever again wield fear as a blade. The irony was sharp enough to cut stone. The man who had ordered a spy to be devoured by vermin had himself become the prey of his own making. The rats of fear he had unleashed now gnawed at his throne, his crown, his soul. Night after night he dreamed of them, red eyes gleaming in the dark, claws scratching at his chamber door, teeth sinking into flesh. And he would wake in a sweat, the candles burned low, the dawn still far off, and know that no guard could keep them out. For the rats he feared most did not come on 4 legs. They came on 2, and they were everywhere. And so as winter settled upon the kingdom, as frost painted the stones silver, and the rivers ran slow and black, the king sat alone in his great hall. The fires roared but could not warm him. The wine flowed but could not steady his hand. And he listened not for the songs of minstrels, not for the cheers of his people, but for the soft, terrible sound of scratching at the door. And he wondered in the silent hours before dawn, had the spy in those final moments felt as he did now, helpless, hunted, haunted. He would never know. For the rats that devour kings are not so kind as to leave the crown untouched. The nights grew longer. The cold sank deeper into the stones of the castle. And with each passing dusk, the king's world shrank a little more. The great halls, once filled with revelry and music, echoed now with emptiness. The courtiers, once eager for favor, vanished like mist at dawn. Even the guards at his chamber door stood distant, silent, their eyes lowered, their hearts already gone. And yet the king clung to his throne, as if the weight of the crown could shield him from the storm he had summoned. He ordered more spies, more informants, more watchers to watch the watchers. But no report, no oath, no blade could quiet the scratching at the edges of his mind, the sound of betrayal closing in. One night the summons came, not to the court, not to the council chamber, but to his own bedchamber. A soft knock, a messenger, pale as the moon, bearing not a sword, not a scroll, but a simple truth: his time had come. Not by assassin's blade, not by rebel's hand, but by the collapse of all he had built. His kingdom, his power, his name all devoured by the rats of fear he had once set loose. He did not rage, he did not beg. He merely nodded, the gesture of a man who had seen this end long before it arrived. He dismissed the messenger, rose, and walked to the window. Outside, the land he had ruled lay silent beneath the frost, the villages dark, the fields bare, the rivers frozen, a kingdom of ghosts. He turned and with slow, deliberate steps shed the trappings of power, the rings, the robe, the crown. Each piece laid down as if he could peel away the years of tyranny, the layers of dread, the bloodstains unseen but felt. And at last he stood as he had on the day of his coronation, a man alone before the eyes of gods and ghosts. He descended to the crypt himself. No retinue, no herald, only the sound of his own footsteps, hollow and final. There among the tombs of kings who had ruled with wisdom, with valor, with grace, he knelt and waited. Not for forgiveness, not for redemption, but for the rats, the real ones and the ones that wore human faces. And they came, not in a rush, not in fury, but in the quiet, relentless way that doom always does. A servant, his hands trembling, carrying a goblet of bitter draught. A captain of the guard, his blade sheathed, his eyes wet with shame. A priest pale and wordless to mark the passing of a soul. The king raised the cup. The poison burned his throat as fear had burned his soul for years. And as the darkness took him, he heard at last the sound that had haunted him, the scratching, the scurrying, the soft, terrible hunger of the rats. But this time there were no walls to hold them back, no doors to bar their way. They had been within him all along. Above the castle stood silent. The fires burned low, the banners hung limp. And the kingdom, freed at last from the shadow of its fearful master, took its first breath of bitter broken dawn. But was it truly free? Or had the rats once loosed found new kings to feed upon? The people would speak of that night for generations, of a king who ruled by fear and was devoured by it, of a lesson written not in books but in blood and bone. And in the quiet corners of the realm where the brave whispered of rebellion, they reminded each other of this truth: no throne, no crown, no sword can guard against the hunger of the rats once they are set upon the world. The great hall was empty now. The crown lay upon the stone floor, its jewels dull in the pale light of dawn. And outside, the land waited for a new king, a new age, a new hope. Or perhaps for more of the same. For once the rats taste power, they do not easily forget the feast. And so the tale ends not with a battle, not with a victory, but with a silence as deep and endless as the crypt where the last king of fear met his end. The crypt was still. The rats had had their fill of flesh, of fear, of the last breath of a king who once imagined himself immortal. And above the castle seemed to exhale. The weight lifted. The walls heavy with secrets and screams stood silent. No bells tolled for the dead. No banners flew at half-mast. The king's passing was marked only by the cold wind that swept through empty halls. But beyond those walls the whispers began. First in hushed voices, then louder, braver. The king was dead. The tyrant had fallen. And with him the veil of terror he had draped over the land was torn aside. Farmers spoke of it as they tilled frozen fields. Merchants murmured it in shadowed markets. Even the priests who had once blessed his name now spoke of divine justice. And yet what justice was there truly? The rats had claimed their prize, but the scars remained. A kingdom bled not just in war, but in the slow poison of fear. Families broken by betrayal, villages hollowed by suspicion, children raised on tales of dungeons and rats instead of honor and hope. The tyrant was gone, but his legacy that would take generations to cleanse. In the great hall where once minstrels sang and goblets clinked in toasts, the silence was deafening. The crown lay abandoned upon the stone, its jewels dulled, its promise broken. No hand reached for it, no voice dared claim it, for all knew to wear that crown was to inherit not just power, but the curse that came with it. And the courtiers, the lords, the ministers who had feasted at the king's table, who had cheered as his enemies fell, they vanished like smoke. Some fled into exile, seeking new masters to serve. Others cloaked themselves in repentance, as if words could wash away the blood. A few bolder or more foolish dreamed of seizing the throne, only to find the people's eyes hard, untrusting, unwilling to bow so easily again. For the people had learned. They had seen what fear wrought. They had watched as a kingdom ate itself, as a king became his own worst enemy. And they were done, kneeling, done, cowering, done, feeding the rats. But could they truly be free? Could any land once ruled by terror shake off its chains so easily? The wounds ran deep. The dungeons, though empty now, still smelled of death. The gallows stood dark reminders of a darker age. And in the corners of taverns, in the quiet of night, some still whispered that perhaps fear was safer. That perhaps it kept the peace. That perhaps the rats should never have been loosed or caged again. And so the kingdom stood at a crossroads. The tyrant was gone. The crown lay waiting. And the people, they held their breath, wondering which path they would choose. One of hope, or one that led inevitably back to the shadows, back to the rats. What of the man, the spy, whose death had begun this spiral? His name was forgotten, swallowed by the legend of his end, but his story, that lived on. Mothers told it to frighten children from lies. Soldiers spoke of it in camps, warning of betrayal's price. And in the halls of power, where new kings would one day rise, his fate hung like a specter, a reminder that to play at secrets was to gamble one's soul. The scrolls would not record his deeds. The statues would not bear his likeness. But in every fearful glance, in every cautious word, in every quiet act of defiance, his shadow stretched long. For he had shown them all, king and commoner alike, that in a world ruled by fear, there are no victors. Only prey, only predators, and only the rats, always the rats feasting in the dark. And the crown, it remained there upon the cold stone as the sun rose and fell day after day. A symbol of power no man dared claim, a relic of an age drowned in blood and betrayal. It gathered dust, it gathered silence, and in that silence perhaps the kingdom found its truest lesson, that no throne is worth the price of one's soul once sold to fear. So ends the tale of a king devoured not by enemies, but by the terror he himself unleashed. And so begins perhaps a new chapter if those who remain are wise enough to learn.